May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In 8th grade, I showed up to my religion class one day, and the teacher said, "Okay, everyone, I trust that you all did your assigned reading in the Gospel of Luke," and we all nodded our heads. And she said, "Well, Sari, why don't you tell everyone in the class what happened in Luke chapter 24? And of course, that was the day that I had not done my reading. And so I had to think quick of the best excuse I could possibly give the teacher, and so I thought of one. It was brilliant. I mean, this excuse was so good that it even convinced me that I had actually done this. And so I said to her, Miss Dobson, Luke chapter 24, I'm so sorry. I thought you meant Luke chapter 25, and that's the reading that I had done. And friends, that was the day that I learned that there is no Luke chapter 25. Chapter 24 is as far as it goes. And that's the chapter that we're in today. This is an amazing chapter. This entire last chapter of the Gospel of Luke is dedicated to talking about the resurrection. Just before chapter 24 starts, you have the tomb and Jesus was buried. Chapter 24 begins with the experience of these few women who were part of Jesus's inner circle. They go to the tomb early one morning and they find that the tomb is empty. And not one but two angels show up and they tell them, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" And so these three or four women run back to the disciples where we're told are gathered, and they say to them in amazement, "You're not going to believe what we just saw." And so immediately Peter runs to the tomb to check it out himself. The tomb is empty. He has no idea what to make of this. And we're told that two of the people who were there, two of the disciples who were there in that room, who had seen all of this happen, they immediately that day, they take a walk to Emmaus, which was a town not far from Jerusalem. And that's where we're assuming they're spending the night during the Passover. And while they're on the journey, Jesus shows up and he starts walking with them. And even though they know Jesus, they've been with him for 3 years, they have no idea that it's him. They just don't recognize him. And it's not until the very end, as Anne just read to us, as he's breaking bread, that they see who he is. So immediately, once they recognize him, they run back to Jerusalem, where they had just come from, and they go to the disciples who are still in the room, and they say, "You guys aren't going to believe this. Jesus appeared to us." And the other disciples are like, "Well, you know what? Jesus also appeared to Peter." And right as they were talking about that, Jesus shows up in their midst. This is all happening in one chapter. So exciting. And Jesus shows up and he says, "Peace be with you," right in their midst. And I love this moment. I mean, just think about how smooth Jesus is. They're like, "Is he alive? Is he dead?" And Jesus just shows up, "Peace be with you." You know, like, how cool is he? And they're like, "Oh my gosh." And the words that just keep popping up over and over throughout this gospel are words like amazement, wonder, surprise, disbelief. These words that are trying to capture the experience of these first people who encountered the message of the resurrection. Jesus was dead, and now he is alive. Amazement, wonder, surprise, disbelief. And it's like right from the start, Luke and the other gospel writers who tell their own versions of this story, they're telling us right from the start that the resurrection, Jesus rising from the dead, is an unbelievable story. It's unbelievable. Now, when I say unbelievable, I'm not using it in the way that we typically think of this word or how we use it. So we usually say things like, "Man, that athlete is unbelievable," or that that mega storm was unbelievable, or it's unbelievable how we were watching the news just a few months ago and how the coronavirus started in some small province in China, and then before we knew it, it was here with us. That is unbelievable, how global we are and how something like that can just arrive so quickly. So typically when we use the word unbelievable, we use it to describe things that are mind-boggling or things that are awe-inspiring, things that bring amazement. But here's the thing about our typical use of this word, is we tend to think of things that are improbable and yet are still within the realm of possibility. They're improbable. You wouldn't think it could happen or would happen, but it's still within the realm of possibility. You can still imagine how it can happen. So for example, it is improbable that a president of the United States would say that we should inject bleach into our bloodstream as a way of disinfecting from the coronavirus. That's improbable. But because it's Donald Trump, it is not impossible, right? So that's, I think, one of the examples I'm giving, and I could not resist that one today, so you'll have to forgive me. So it's usually in the realm of possibility, but it's not as common. And that is what we say is amazing or unbelievable. When we talk about the resurrection, we're using the word unbelievable in a different sense. We're not talking about something that is a figure of speech, just as an expression. We're talking about it as a literal concept. The actual fundamental meaning of unbelievable, which is something that is beyond belief. You simply cannot believe that it is true. And what makes the resurrection so unbelievable simply is that it is beyond the realm of possibility. There's no real proof for it. You can't imagine how it can happen. You can't conceive of it. It's beyond scientific proof. Things that we think are possible in the grand scheme of things, experientially or what we've heard, there just isn't the evidence that we need to know that that is something that we can believe. And we as human beings are just programmed in such a way where comprehending something, understanding it, wrapping our minds around it is what makes us feel like we can really get a sense for our surroundings. So when we can't understand something, when we can't really figure something out, it leaves us feeling more vulnerable. We just have this innate sense that to understand, to grasp, to wrap our minds around something makes something safer. It makes it so that we feel less vulnerable. Have you ever, for example, have you ever Googled something secretly while you were in a meeting because you just couldn't really understand what everyone else around the table was talking about and you didn't want to admit it? And so you just kind of Googled it just to kind of figure out, oh, okay, that's what we're talking about. Or have you ever been in a conversation with someone and they just allude to something as though it is common knowledge, and you just nod your head and you pretend like you know what they're talking about, but you have no earthly idea what it is that they're referring to? Have you ever done that? Why do we do this? I'm going to just go ahead and assume that you're all nodding your heads right now. And it just makes me feel better when I'm giving these stories, as though that's an assumption, right? That you are nodding your head and you're agreeing with me. So why do we do this? It's because it is hard to admit when we don't know something, especially when it feels like it could be embarrassing. Because here's the truth, that we feel safer when we know. And when we don't know something, when we don't have the information, we feel more vulnerable. There's this interesting syndrome called Imposter Syndrome. The estimates are about 70% of the world at some point in time feel this thing, which is, I feel like a fraud. We're talking professionals in their field who think to themselves at some point, there's this crisis, like, what am I doing this? I just don't feel like I know enough. And people are looking to me, and I feel like I'm defending my dissertation, or teaching these classes, or I'm pastoring a church, and I feel like a fraud because I feel like I should know more. When we don't feel like we know, when we don't understand everything there is to understand, it leaves us feeling vulnerable. There's this quote by the notable and popular astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, in which he says one of the greatest challenges of life is that you know enough to think you're right, but you don't know enough about a subject to know you're wrong. Isn't that just an amazing quote? You know enough about a subject to think you're right, but you don't know enough about it to know you're wrong. And anyone who hears that just knows that you've been in situations in life where you have moved on with something, and in a conversation, you really didn't have much of a clue about it, and you probably just didn't sound very smart. It leaves you feeling vulnerable. And so the vehicle, all of this, the reason I'm telling you this is that the vehicle we usually trust prove that something is true is the vehicle that we always use, which is knowledge, understanding, grasping a subject matter, scientific data. We use these things as our vehicle to arrive to a place from A to B where we can say, I have proof for this. And yet, our faith is built upon, this is not tangential, this is the most important piece of our faith. It's built upon the story of the resurrection, which is an unbelievable truth. So if by not understanding something, by not comprehending it, we feel like we just feel less safe and more vulnerable, is it possible that when it comes to our faith, many of us feel least confident when it comes to the resurrection, which is the most important, most central part of our faith, because we can't understand it. That when we think of the weakest link in the chain in our own faith journey, we think to ourselves, gosh, the resurrection, I don't really get how that's possible. So I get Jesus's life, I get his teachings. Even though it's hard to think about loving my enemies, I can understand how that can break the cycle of violence. But when it comes to the resurrection, I just can't make that leap. And I just don't really understand it. I don't know how to explain it to myself. I don't know how to explain it to my children. And so it feels like the weakest link in the chain. That's where my faith feels most vulnerable, because I don't understand it. I think for most of us, the answer is yes. The resurrection, the most important and central part of our faith, feels like the weakest and most vulnerable part of our belief system, because we just don't understand it. So what I want to offer us today is a paradigm shift, and that is simply to say that what we perceive or might perceive to be the most vulnerable part of our belief system, what we believe to be true, the weakest part of that is in fact the complete opposite, that it is the strongest part. The fact that you can never arrive at the resurrection intellectually. You just can't get there rationally, you can't get there scientifically, that it forces us to look for a completely different vehicle to get to a place where we can say, this is true. A different vehicle entirely, not the one that we always use. Something that if we actually put into motion, will open up an entirely different world for us. A world that opens us up to something as wonderful and as beautiful as childlike wonder. Let me share a story with you. A few weeks ago, probably about a month, Tannery and I and the kids went to the park, and we took our kite with us. And it was a wonderful, just a sunny day, and the winds were perfect to fly the kite. And just as we were walking in to the park, I said to the kids, I said, you know, one of the most frustrating things when I was a kid was getting things stuck in trees. And of course, that's what happened that day. This kite was at the very end of its string. I mean, like, it was so high that I couldn't tell that it was actually behind the trees. It looked like it was in front of the trees because of how high it was. But then it just lost some wind and it went down and it got stuck in the highest tree that was in the park. I mean, this thing was so high. And I worked with this thing. I worked with it probably for an hour trying to get it down, and I got it off one branch, it fell, and then it got completely stuck, and there was no getting it down. So in the end, I told the kids, I'm really sorry that this happened within the first 5 minutes of us flying this kite, and I just cut the string, and we went home. So 2 weeks later, family and I go to our other favorite park. Now, these two parks are 1 mile apart from one another. And we're at this other park, the only other park we go to, right, of the two. And we're laying down in the grass, we're playing, and I look up in the tree, and there in a tree 1 mile away is a kite. And it's not, I looked at it for a second, and family's like, do you think that's our kite? I'm like, it is absolutely our kite. It's not like one of those you get at Walmart or Target. I got this years ago at a small boutique toy store. And it type, and I looked at it, and I just could not believe that the kite had flown from one park of all the places that it could go, all directions, and landing in any place, it would land in the other park where we were, and we would be the ones to find it. And immediately I was just like, this is unbelievable. And we got up together, Tannery got on my shoulders, and she pulled it down from the string that was hanging, and we brought it and we were looking at it. And I was like, this is unbelievable. What are the chances? And it led to this place where, you know, I could have just said, man, the chances are slim, but it is completely possible that a kite would break free from one tree and come land here. I mean, it's improbable this would happen, but it is possible. And it could have just explained it away, but there was a part of me, and I think you feel this maybe as I'm telling the story, that just felt like there was more here. It was almost like someone was sending us a message. It was almost like a moment of connection. I didn't know what it meant. I had no idea what to take away from this crazy, crazy experience, but I felt like there was a message in here where I could say, thank you, God. I don't know what you're saying, but thank you. I felt seen, we felt connected, and it was just so beautiful. And I share this story with you because I believe that this other vehicle that leads us to a place where we can understand stories like the resurrection, this other vehicle is what we call faith. The reason that faith is so amazing is because it leads to the wow. Things that we can understand that are within the realm of possibility, they can be amazing, but if we only look to those things that can be explained away and only look for that as our explanation for proof, we end up just going, okay, it's possible, and so maybe it's chance, or maybe it's just a fluke that this happened this one time. But faith is the part that says, wow, I think something else might be going on here. It's the part that takes something like a stupid kite flying 1 mile away and landing in a tree that only you would find. It makes that into something connective between you and your creator and the universe. No, the resurrection is not the point of greatest vulnerability. It's the opposite. It is actually our entry point into the most powerful piece of our relationship with God, which is wonder. But Sari, I don't understand the resurrection. Good, But I can't wrap my mind around how it's possible that someone can be dead and alive. If you were to ask me today, if I believe that someone down the street who was dead rose to life, I would not believe that story. Awesome. I'm so glad that you can't understand it. And I'm so glad that I can't understand it. Because if it was understandable, if it was within the realm of possibility, our understanding of God, our concept of God would be so much smaller than it is right now. The resurrection is what makes us go, there's something else going on here. What does it mean for me that at the center of my faith is a story about the impossible taking place when I think that there's nothing else, there's no hope, there's nothing else that science can do to tell me that there is hope in this situation? What does it mean that at the center of my faith is a story of God doing the impossible and blowing our minds and causing us to enter into a space of wonder? How does that change my view about the world? No. The resurrection and not understanding it is not the weakest part. It's not the part where we're most vulnerable. It is the part where we are strongest and where we are most alive as Christians. I want to end today with a quote by Einstein, because I think it is so appropriate coming from a scientist. The most beautiful thing that we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom the emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. To know what is impenetrable to us, really impenetrable, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, which our dull faculties can comprehend only in the most primitive forms. This knowledge, this feeling, is at the center of true religion. Amen.